What's up guys, it's Zach from TechSource and welcome to the build guide everyone has been waiting for. If you've never built a PC in your life because you don't know how, or maybe you're just scared you might damage something, well, I'm here to tell you that it's gonna be fine because this is a step-by-step, very detailed build guide made just for beginners. I'm also gonna show you guys how to install Windows, how to download and install the drivers, and I'm even gonna show you how to overclock the GPU so that way you can get more frames out of it. If you guys are using different parts than what I have in my build, then that is completely fine. You can actually use this build guide to help you build your own PC as well. The PC we are building today is the popular Blue Lotus, which is a sub $700 PC that will destroy any game you throw at it over 60 FPS, whether you're playing GTA 5, Destiny 2, or even PUBG. If you guys want to check out the benchmarks I did for this PC, I'll leave a link below along with all the parts I used. There's a few things I recommend before building a PC. Now obviously you will need all 7 parts, but aside from that I recommend a screwdriver. The kit I'm using here is from iFixit and it offers all the necessary tools for a complete PC build. I'll drop a link below if you guys want to check it out. I also recommend 1 or 2 shot glasses or any small tray that will serve as a place to keep your screws safe because they tend to roll around on the table and get lost. Another thing you will need is a blank USB with at least 8 gigs of space, and finally, if you're not going to be using the Ethernet cable to connect to the internet, a Wi-Fi adapter is a cheap alternative of connecting to the internet wirelessly. This is the one I'm using for the video and I strongly recommend. It costs $25 but offers up to 1200 megabits per second with support for 2.4 and 5.8 gigahertz bands. If you're building on carpet, I do recommend building on a wooden desk. However, metal surfaces are fine as well, as long as it's properly grounded. You don't need to buy an anti-static mat or wristband. However, if you want to be extra cautious, you can pick one up for only $6 on Amazon. And once again, I'll drop a link to it below. I've been building PCs well over 5 years now, and I've never used one of those anti-static things, but it's better to be safe than sorry. Don't shuffle your feet on carpet. Don't pet your cat. As long as you touch a metal surface that's grounded before you handle your components, then you'll be completely fine. Also, another tip when handling the parts: if there's a plastic section or a plastic piece on it, make sure you're grabbing it from that. And also, make sure you guys aren't touching any of the circuit side with your hands. That's also one way of damaging the components. Step 1. You will need the motherboard, CPU, and RAM sticks. So put the other boxes aside and begin opening up the motherboard box. Once you take it out of the anti-static bag, place it on the top of the motherboard box, but actually before you do that, make sure to take out the following from inside. You will need the IO shield and the SATA cables, one for each storage device we are connecting. If you have only one drive, then one is all you need. Next, take out the CPU and its cooler from the box and be very careful not to touch the bottom part of the cooler because it does come pre-applied with thermal paste. If you're gonna set it down on the table, set it upside down so that the thermal paste is facing upwards. Make sure you are handling the CPU from its edges. Do not touch the bottom or the surface of the processor. If you look closely at your CPU, you will find a triangle on one of the corners. You're gonna have to align that triangle with a CPU socket cover. Go back to the motherboard and push down on the lever and pull it out from its side and lift it up until the cover flips open. Gently lower the CPU down into the socket while grabbing it from both sides. Again, do not touch the surface of it, and make sure that the 2 triangles are aligned and gently let it go. Do not apply any force on the CPU. It should fall right in place. You can tell if it's completely seated by checking out the 2 notches near the edges. Gently lower the cover down and lock the CPU in place. The black piece usually pops right off if you tighten the lever, but if it doesn't, make sure to pull it out before you continue. Now it's time to install the cooler. If you're using a different cooler, just make sure to follow the instructions on the manual. It's very easy to install. However, if you're using the stock cooler like me in the video, then all you have to do is align the 4 pins from the heatsink to the 4 holes on the motherboard. But before you install it, you have to make sure the cable is long enough to reach the fan header on the motherboard. In my case, it was like a few centimeters too short if I were to install it right side up. So unfortunately, I had to rotate the cooler about 45 degrees to get that extra cable slack. Gently lower the cooler on top of the CPU while making sure all the 4 pins aligned with the 4 holes on the motherboard, and then you can go ahead and let go of the cooler and press down on the legs one at a time. Make sure you are locking the pins diagonally. Tug on the cooler a little bit to make sure it's fully secured. Once all the 4 pins are locked in the board, it's time to hook up the cooler fan, so grab the 4-pin cable from the heatsink and connect it to the CPU fan header on the motherboard, which should be right next to the RAM sticks above the cooler. Now it's time to install the RAM sticks. If you guys look on the motherboard, you will see a label showing you what RAM slots to occupy first. If there are 2 sticks, you have to install them on A2 and B2 before you occupy the others. If you're installing only one, then you have to put it in slot A2 only. Grab the RAM stick one at a time and make sure the gap on the bottom of the RAM stick aligns with the notch on the RAM slot. As you guys can see in the video, it's facing the incorrect way, so I had to flip it the opposite way. Gently lower the RAM stick down evenly and push down from the center until it snaps in place. Feel free to use both of your hands to do this. If you pay attention, both of the clips on the sides should lock in place if done right. Take off both side panels from the PC by removing all 4 of the thumb screws. Afterwards, I put the screws in one of the shot glasses so that they don't get lost. Every case comes with either a box or a bag of screws needed to install the hardware, so take the bag or box out of the case and set it aside for now. Next, it's time to install the IO shield, so tear that out of the plastic and make sure you're holding it so that the 6 circles are on the bottom and slide it in the back of the case from the inside. If you can get the IO shield installed, then you can pretty much build a PC. This is literally the hardest part of building any rig. Make sure you're applying pressure on all 4 corners evenly until it snaps in place. Whatever you do, do not apply pressure in the center, otherwise it will bend and most likely crack. Use the corners instead. Next up, we need to install the standoffs, but this case actually comes with 6 of them already pre-installed. However, we do need to install the other 3 on the right side since we are using an ATX motherboard. You can find the standoff screws inside the bag that you removed from the case earlier. The best way to figure out which standoff screws you will need to install is by just placing the motherboard in the case and figuring out where the holes align. As you guys can see, the top 3 are missing standoff screws, so I went ahead and installed them right after. You're gonna need this type of screw to secure the motherboard in. Mine uses 8, however every motherboard is different depending on the form factor. Just look at how many holes your motherboard has and that's how many screws you will need. Start by screwing them in one by one. Feel free to use a crisscross pattern until the motherboard is fully tightened down. Whatever you do, make sure you guys do not over tighten the motherboard. We might as well connect the rear fan to the motherboard right now and get it out of the way. So grab the 3-pin cable coming from the rear fan and connect it to the system fan header on the motherboard, which should be right next to the side of the RAM sticks. Let's hook up the power supply now. So with the fan facing down, slide the power supply towards the back of the case and make sure the 4 screw holes align with the cutouts on the case before you start screwing them in. You will need 4 of these screws, which you can find either in the bag that came with the case or in the tiny bag that comes with the power supply. Now it's time to hook up the storage. If you're using either an SSD or a hard drive, you can use one of these 3 hard drive bays. You'll need to match the screw holes on the hard drive with the 2 knobs on the tray. With the back end of the hard drive facing towards the end, lower one side of the drive in and slide the other side in by stretching the tray a little bit. You can also put an SSD in here as well, but you'll need 4 tiny screws to install them. You can find those screws in the same bag. Additionally, you can install your SSD up here near the optical drive area, or you can hook it up in the back of the case on its side. Just make sure to tighten all 4 screws to hold it in place. Now it's time to hook up your storage device. So whether you're using a hard drive or an SSD, you will need a SATA cable that we pulled out from the motherboard earlier. We're also going to need 1 data cable that you can find coming out of the power supply. Looking at the back of the hard drive, you will need to plug the SATA cable in the smaller slot, and I do recommend using the L-shaped cable instead of the straight one for easier cable management. And the other end connects to the motherboard, but pay attention to this part because it's important. If you're installing an M.2 SSD, do not use SATA 1. It's actually labeled right on the motherboard. Instead, you can use SATA 2 or any of the other SATA ports right below that, like I've done in this video. The data cable connects right next to the SATA cable. If it doesn't fit in the first time, turn it upside down and try it again. Both of these cables only fit one way. So this is what your PC should look like so far. All the main components are connected, and the final piece we need to hook up is the graphics card. Don't worry about cable management just yet. We can work on that once everything is completed. By the way, I hope you guys are enjoying the build guide so far. Believe it or not, it does take me a very long time to put this all together, and dropping a simple like would be very appreciated. Thank you. Start by removing the screw in the back to access the PCI slots. So you'll need to remove the second and third PCI covers, and the best way to do this is by folding it a few times until it snaps off. You will need to align this part of the PCB on your GPU with the top PCI slot on the motherboard. and it's always recommended to install your GPU on the top slot for most performance. Gently bring the GPU closer until you can feel it slide in place, and once you feel it sinking in, apply some pressure until you hear it snap in place. While holding the GPU at the same time, screw in the PCI bracket in the back of the case. That way it prevents the GPU from sagging. If you accidentally remove the top PCI bracket like me, you can take this time to put it back on. Close the cover and screw it shut once you are done. Now it's time to connect all the cables, and we can start off with the GPU cable labeled PCIe, and it looks something like this. Grab the 6-pin part and connect it to the GPU socket near the edge of the card, and make sure you guys hear it snap in place. Next, we are ready to give some power to the motherboard, so grab the 24-pin cable that looks like this and connect it to the 24-pin socket on the motherboard. Make sure it sits flush and that there is no gap between it. Always remember, if it doesn't fit, it doesn't belong there. Next up is the cable with the words CPU labeled on it. Combine both of them together and slide it in the socket right above the CPU cooler to the left. The next cable has a blue tip, and this is to power the front USB 3.0 ports on the case. If you don't have any USB 3 ports in the front, then you don't have this cable. So this one connects right under the 24 pin we just connected. Just make sure that the notch is facing the correct direction before inserting it in, because if it's incorrect, you can damage the pins. Also make sure you are inserting it at a straight angle. If it's slightly bent, you can also damage the pins that way. The other cable is used to power the front audio port so that you can connect your headset or microphone, and it's labeled HD audio. This one connects to the far left side of the motherboard on the bottom, and the pins on the motherboard are labeled J Audio 1 in case you are having problems finding it. With the words on the cable facing up, insert the connector gently. You might need to apply some pressure for it to go all the way in. The USB connector is to power the other two USB ports, and this one can go in either of the USB headers on the motherboard labeled JUSB 2 or JUSB 1. You can find both of them on the bottom side of the motherboard towards the middle. Now it's time to hook up the two fans in the front of the case. Grab both of the Molex connectors coming out of each fan, and you're going to connect it to the Molex connector coming out of the PSU. We're basically going to chain all three of them together, so connect one to the PSU and you can connect the other one right on top of it, just like this. And finally, the last set of cables we need to connect is to power the front panel of the case. However, you need to pay attention to this one because it's a little different from the others. The first one we are connecting is labeled Reset SW, which is short for switch. With the words facing down, you need to connect this to pin number 3 and pin number 4 on the bottom row, just like this. Next up is the power switch. With the words facing up, we're gonna plug this right on top of the reset switch. To be honest, the direction doesn't really matter on these two, but I did it this way to make it easy for you guys to follow. The next cable is the HDD LED, and this one actually matters which way you plug it in. Make sure the words are facing down before plugging it in right next to the reset switch on the second row, just like this. The final two are the power LED plus and minus pins. The plus goes in first, followed by the minus one. It's actually easier to go backwards, so I plugged in the minus one on the second pin, and then I plugged in the plus cable. If you did it correctly, this is how it should look like from the bottom of the motherboard. We got the HDD LED first, and then the reset switch. And from the opposite side, this is what it should look like. Coming from the right to left, you should see the power LED plus, power LED minus, followed by the power switch. Notice that there is a pin missing, as well as there being an extra pin right next to that, and that's completely normal. You're officially done plugging everything in. Take this time to work on the cable management now that you know where everything connects to. Here's a quick tip with the CPU cable. I was actually barely able to run the CPU cable from the back of the motherboard into the socket, and all I had to do was pull the motherboard towards me just a bit in order to give it enough space to squeeze it through, instead of running the entire cable across the motherboard. Obviously, you will need to remove that screw on the motherboard in order to pull it forward. For the front panel cables, I was able to route them through the front of the case, through the side of the fans, and then out from the back of the case. I made sure to use the extra space underneath the hard disk trays to hide some of that excess cables, and using Velcro straps and zip ties really keeps everything nice and tidy. If you followed all the steps, then you are pretty much done. Congratulations on building your very first PC, but we are only halfway done. Now it's time to install the operating system, download the drivers, and overclock your GPU. Here are the current timestamps if you guys just want to skip to that portion of the video. First step is to find a computer, either a desktop, PC, or a laptop with a working USB port, because you will need to plug in your 8GB USB drive and visit the Microsoft website to download the Windows files. We are installing Windows 10 onto this PC, but I'll leave a link to Windows 8.1 Pro if that's what you guys prefer instead. Click on the Download Tool Now option and open it up once it's done downloading. Follow the on-screen instructions until you get to this page where you have to select the Create Installation Media. Afterwards, you can hit Next. Keep everything default and make sure you guys are selecting the USB drive that you want the files installed on. Keep in mind everything will be deleted on that USB stick, so save the files that you want to keep. Click on Next and let it download and do its thing. Once everything is done, it will tell you that your USB drive is ready to go, so click on Done. Take the USB drive and plug it into your PC that you just built and hit the power button. If it doesn't turn on, make sure the switch on the back is flipped to the straight line indicator. Once your PC boots, you will get a first time boot message stating that you have to hit a certain key to load default settings in the BIOS and continue or something similar. It's usually the F5 key, but whatever it is, make sure you're paying attention to what it says on the screen because we're going to be skipping the BIOS setup for now. Your computer will now try and detect an operating system. Now obviously there is none, so it will boot straight from a USB drive by default and it will take you to the Windows setup screen. Anyways, once you get to the Windows setup screen, just follow the on-screen instructions until it asks you to enter in the CD key. You can either pay full price for it and get it online, or you can get it cheaper on Kingwin. Once you get your key, enter it in here and click Next. Select the correct version of Windows that you purchased for the CD key, and then you can click Next again. And over here, you will need to select Custom. Over here, we get to pick where we want the operating system installed on. If you have only one drive, then the selection is obvious. However, if you have several, then you have to select which one to install the operating system. I recommend installing the OS on an SSD or an M.2 drive, whichever one you have. If you don't have either, then it doesn't really matter. A quick note, if the drive has files on it and you don't mind wiping it clean, then you will need to format it before you click Next, otherwise it won't let you install the files. Keep in mind that you will lose all the data in your hard drive. Once you hit Next, sit back and relax while Windows installs the files onto your drive. This process can take up to 30 minutes depending on the drive speed. Once you are done, it will take you to the setup screen, so just make sure to follow the on-screen instructions until it takes you to the Wi-Fi setup. Now this is where the Wi-Fi card comes in handy because without it, you can't access the internet until you download the drivers. Finish setting everything up until Windows takes you to the desktop. Now if you guys are having problems with your PC, whether it's not turning on or you're getting a black screen on boot, whatever it is, I've listed some troubleshooting tips down below if you guys want to check that out. If you have access to the internet, then we need to download the drivers straight onto this PC. However, if you don't have access, then you will need to use another computer to download the drivers onto a USB and then bring those files back to the PC you just built. So visit the MSI service page for the board and download the following drivers. Once all of them are downloaded, open each file and make sure you guys extract the contents out of the folder before installing them, otherwise you might run into some errors. Next, it's time to install the graphics driver. Visit the GeForce website and download the GeForce Experience. By the way guys, I'll drop a link to all of this down below, so all you have to do is click on the link and just download all the files. Once all the drivers are up to date and installed, do a fresh restart of the PC, but immediately hit the delete key so that we can get into the BIOS. We can't overclock the CPU since it has a locked processor, but we can set the XMP profile for the RAM, and that way we can squeeze out more performance out of this build. Once you are in the BIOS, hit the F7 key to switch to advanced mode, and from here select the overclock settings. Then we can scroll down and enable extreme memory profile. And for the DRAM frequency, we're gonna set it to 3600 MHz. Finally, we have to scroll down and set the DRAM voltage to 1.35. Once you are done with all of that, hit F10, which will save the changes and it will take you back to the desktop. Alright guys, now it's time to overclock your GPU, and for that we need both MSI Afterburner and the Heaven Benchmark tool. Once again, I'll leave a link below to download them. They are both completely free. Install and open up both programs, but first let's open up the Heaven Benchmark tool and make sure that the full screen option is not checked, and put the resolution to 1080p and hit run. It will start running in the background. At this time, open up MSI Afterburner so that it's overlapping the Heaven Benchmark just like how it is in the video. We're going to be dragging the power limit and temp limit bar all the way up to the right side so it's maxed out. And from here, we're going to be gradually increasing the core clock speed until the GPU crashes. I normally do increments of 25 megahertz. So I double click on the +0 icon right above the bar and enter in my own value. I start off with 25 megahertz. I wait about 5 seconds, and if it doesn't crash, I bump it up another 25 megahertz. I keep doing this until I reach a point where the GPU can't handle it anymore and the program begins to crash. As you guys can see, I got it all the way up to 250 megahertz before the Heaven benchmark started crashing. That means the core clock is set too high and the GPU can't handle it, so we're gonna have to go back and lower the clock speed. So I set it back to 225 instead of 250 and reran the benchmark. Now that we know it can handle 225, we need to leave the benchmark running for a full cycle just to make sure it's stable. Once the benchmark completes and it doesn't crash, we are ready to move on to the memory clock. Again, it's the same concept over here, however, I do increments of 100 instead of 25 since memory is a lot easier to overclock. So naturally, I start with 200, I wait 5 seconds, bump it up another 100, and so on and so forth until we get a crash. So I got it to 500 megahertz before the benchmark started freezing, so obviously I pushed it way too much. I'm gonna put it back to 400 megahertz and restart the benchmark. Now instead of increasing about 100, I'm gonna try 50 instead and see how far I can go. As you can see, it still crashed, even at 450, so the sweet spot is obviously somewhere between 450 and 400. I lowered the memory clock speed to 425, and I let it run for a full cycle, and voila! A stable clock speed, over 2000 megahertz on the boost clock, and 8856 on the memory. Now, if your PC freezes or crashes during gaming, then that means you have to lower the clock speed even more. The Heaven benchmark isn't that demanding on the GPU, so when you play games like PUBG, which are more demanding, it might push your GPU even further, and that is when you'll start seeing crashes. So if that does happen, go back and lower the clock speed, and if that doesn't work, then you have to lower the memory clock speed as well. You just have to play around with both of them until you find a sweet spot. But yeah guys, that pretty much wraps up this build guide. It took me almost a week to make this video. It was a very long process, so dropping a like or even a dislike would be appreciated. And let me know in the comment section if you guys are planning to build this exact same PC or if it was helpful. Anyways, thank you so much again for watching. I will see you guys in the next one.